All right. And we can get started. Heather with 3J is going to be the main person today. So I'm just going to hand it off to you. Unless, well, we've got a couple of people that maybe weren't here last time. Heather, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Austin. I'm a planner with 3J Consulting. We work in communities all over the state on projects like this, housing. We've worked in Newberg before on housing projects, so we're familiar with the city and with what's been done to date. And so this evening, in preparation for our meeting, we looked at your code and your comprehensive plan and took a look at it from a multifamily housing perspective. So we're here tonight to talk about that audit and about what we might do going forward for some clear and objective standards for multifamily housing. And I appreciate that Jason was just bringing up apartment developments and things that are going on in the city. Clearly, there is demand and there is need, and there are things that are happening. So let's work on getting the code updated so that you can easily review these things. Do you want me to just share my screen and go right into the PowerPoint, Mary? Okay.
Sure.
Go ahead and do that. And this is completely interactive work session style. You know, you guys are the ones that we want feedback from. So please jump in. Don't worry about interrupting. Just go ahead. I'm not sure with the PowerPoint showing if I'll be able to see everybody. So don't worry about raising your hand. Just go ahead and unmute and throw out your questions and comments.
I'll also keep watch too. So if you do want to raise your hand, I'll make sure Heather's aware.
Perfect. Thank you, Mary. Okay. Just stick this into display mode. Maybe there we go. All right, well, we're here this evening, as I said, to talk about the multifamily code audit that we completed in preparation for tonight. This is our second meeting. We had a chance to chat with most of you a few months back, and I thought that was a great intro to the project. Mary gave a lot of good background on the state's requirement for addressing needed housing and providing for a clear and objective review path for that to happen. So this project is part of that effort. What we're going to do tonight is just talk through that code audit matrix that was in your packet. We're going to talk a little about clear and objective design review standards that could apply to multifamily housing projects. Public comments, although I think we might have a limited public participation this evening, but that's okay. It'll just give us more chance to have discussion. Oh my gosh, it says project next steps. That should say project next steps. We will talk about what's coming next. My apologies for that one. So as far as the code audit matrix, I did divide it into different category headings in the packet that you received, but I've mixed those up for this evening's discussion to make the conversation flow a little better. So I thought I'd talk about what's currently in place as far as multifamily design review standards, the master plans and the comprehensive plan and what they say now, and then get to talking about the things that we really want to get some feedback on, the review process for multifamily developments, and then the clear and objective review path. And based on our conversation last meeting, we did talk like a little bit about landscaping and outdoor open space and relationship of sites to public parks and that sort of thing. So I wanted to make sure that we captured that part of the discussion as well. Currently, the multifamily design review standards have a section in the code that's related to the site design elements and the building design elements. And I made this an interactive click. We can look at it really fast. There are categories that you can choose from for a multifamily. Site design elements are things like natural features, topography, trees, placement.
We aren't seeing it, Heather, if you have it up.
I'm sorry, I do have it up. So I guess I have to switch over my share screen. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, maybe.
You know. I'm going to stop that share really fast and go over to site design review. Are you seeing it now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So currently a project that would come in for a site design review, depending on how large it is, if you are a smaller project with 5 to 8 units, you would need 14 points. If you're more than that, you'd need 20 points. And each of these items has a point value assigned to it. I know you're all familiar with this. I just wanted to set the stage for where we are now. The point here too is that a lot of these are a bit discretionary. So you do have your decision makers who are determining things like there's respect the scale and patterns of nearby buildings by reflecting architectural styles. You know, that can mean different things to different people. So that's the kind of language we really want to be careful about when we're looking for our clear and objective pathway. But I think, as Mary mentioned at the last meeting, there's a place for these criteria. There is a good way that the city can keep this as a discretionary review process. If an applicant chooses to go through this and wants to have this pathway, that certainly should be an option. But then there can be a clear and objective pathway that is available as well. I do see 2 hands up already, so let's talk to Chris and then Linda.
Hello. Hi, nice to meet you, Heather. I wasn't at the last meeting. In the points, to go back a little bit, on the 22.060, the points that are reflecting for the smaller multifamily projects, and the 20 points reflected for multifamily, will those need to increase the point thresholds, or are they at an appropriate level to account for increases in density for units allowed per acre to bring up the requirement for division 38?
I think your standards that are currently in place as a discretionary pathway are good. They meet the needs of providing design and site criteria and giving that flexibility of getting to choose off the point scale. I didn't recommend any changes to this as a discretionary review path. What we really wanted to focus on was creating a new clear and objective path. So we may choose a few of these items to be on that path, or we may go a completely different direction and have different criteria for that clear and objective path.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep, thanks for that. And Linda?
There we go. Unmute. I'll put my camera on for a minute too.
Sure.
I'm eating my dinner, so I also had a question about the points, and I saw that I read somewhere that you could choose the points from these different categories. 14 points, I think I read somewhere, for one type of building, I believe. So I'm wondering, is that 14 points within the site design and then 14 points within the building design? Or is that 14 points across both areas?
I believe it's across both, but I'll let Mary answer that one if you don't mind.
So
Yes, it's across both.
So I guess my concern is that it seems like there could be so much flexibility that, you know, maybe I'm going off on a weird tangent here, but my concern is that there could be so much flexibility that that things aren't as comparable to the local feel of the area that they could be, if that makes sense. And I don't think I articulated that particularly well, but I just wonder if there's too much flexibility there. I don't know. Just a thought.
Linda, I think it's, you know, so if you took this bundle of criteria and you leave them in a discretionary track, it does leave a lot of flexibility. You know, it leaves a lot of creativity for an architect and a developer to try to figure out what they want to do. But I think, you know, the inverse of that is coming up with clear and objective standards to saying these are the minimums that you have to do, and it becomes very numeric really, at least in my mind, it becomes very numeric in nature. You know, you can't have a wall plane that extends more than X number of feet, and then you need to have X number of feet of recess, and then that recess has X number of feet, and then it has another articulation, and it goes back to the original wall plane. Those are very clear and objective. And so when I've done these before, you've got one path that leaves a lot of flexibility and creativity, and you got another one that creates very prescriptive and rough. But the thing you don't want to do, I'm sorry, Mary, I'm jumping in here, is you don't want to create criteria that you end up looking like you're building barracks off of a US military base.
No, I get that. I understand what you're saying entirely. It was just a thought I had, and I just wondered if any, I don't know, any thoughts have been given to the amount of flexibility given the very, very, very large numbers of elements, and some of them have 3 points, others have just 1 point, and I don't know, they're just the way that they could be configured. And it was, you know, just a question, just a thought, just.
I think that's one where, you know, put it on the list. Do we need to make possibly some adjustments to the discretionary criteria as well? And that's what the committee is for. Give us your feedback and your ideas.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think I can just add, I wasn't part of the group that made the point values, but in the past I have used this type of program, and typically the things that get the 3 points are high priority items for the reviewers. So and often it's very difficult to make the project work with all ones. So it's sort of a way of saying we're going to get a couple 3s and a couple 2s, and then you can choose which ones fill in that are less of a priority to us. So I guess the other question would be like, how's it going? how are things going with the current discretionary review? Are there problems that need to be resolved there? And I'm not really prepared to answer those questions tonight, but we could certainly discuss more about that.
Oh, I think, you know, for the committee members is if you step back and look at what we've done for multifamily in roughly the last 10 years, Deskin Commons on Meridian, flats at Rogers Landing on South River Street, the project on Villa Road at Parkway, and trying to think, do we have anything else more recently? There's some apartments off of Hay Street east of Springbrook. So that's kind of what we've really had recently for multifamily projects. We did approve one for at Crestview Crossing under these particular standards. And it's that one, because it's fresh in my mind, it's 3 separate buildings, 3 stories, you know, walk up suburban garden style apartment complex with parking and landscaping, but it's got, you know, it's got decks on different units and their entryways and so forth. So as you're out, as you can, because you're not functioning as the planning commission, ACAC, if you want to go out and kind of drive by and look at those projects and say, do these work? You know, are they visually appealing or not? You can do that when we come back to the next meeting. You can share your thoughts.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be, what's the word, antagonistic. I'm just kind of asking a question, I guess, to get a better understanding and to see whether or not it might be something that could be or should be, or what have you considered. So, yeah, but you're right. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, and just to Doug's point too, if there are certain things you really love about projects in the city, you know, those might be the things you want on your clear and objective path. And if there are things where you're like, man, this project needed a pedestrian pathway, where is it? You know, then it's like, maybe that should be a requirement for everything kind of thing. So yeah, just really thinking about what do I love and what is missing.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. So that is what we have in place right now. And that was a great side discussion that I hadn't even anticipated. So thank you for that. Currently, there are master plans in the city. A lot of them are codified into the development code. So they either reflect the zoning and the lot sizes and the design reviews of the underlying zoning district. But one notable example that does not is the Springbrook master plan. And I did hear from Doug that there might be changes happening to the portions of Springbrook that do permit the multifamily development in them. Right now, it's like 12 acres of the entire site area that could potentially develop as multifamily. So that seemed pretty low to me, but if that area expands, you might want to look at equating this minimum square footage per dwelling unit closer to the R3 zone, which is the 1,500 per dwelling unit, to be able to provide those more, buildable densities, I guess, in those multifamily type lots. And then as far as the comprehensive plan, also in the audit document, I noted that there was just a few areas where some language needed to be updated as far as, goals and policies related to housing. But Doug and Mary both mentioned that the housing needs analysis is being updated and the housing production strategy. So there's so much housing work going on right now that it's like, which project's going to update the wording in the comprehensive plan first, but we'll keep it on our list and just keep track of it throughout this project as well. So the review process for a multifamily development right now requires a type 2 land use review that requires staff to provide public notice out to property owners within a certain distance of the site. It allows some time, it adds some time for that public notice to happen. And then there's also, the ability for a neighbor to say whether they feel that this application meets the code criteria or not. So that's how that process works. As you know, on Planning Commission, you receive those public notices as well. But that is something to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this more in detail further in this discussion. But is there some version of multifamily where a type 1 process makes sense? If the standards are clear and objective, you lose that public notice, but you gain, you reduce some barriers to getting the development made. So more to come on that one. So I went ahead and I linked here the document that I sent, but I won't share it unless there are specific questions that you'd like me to address from that audit. Were there any questions specifically about the document that I sent in advance? Okay, it was pretty dry. It wasn't too, an audit matrix is not the most exciting type document to review. So thank you for bearing with me on that. So that's great. And that brings us to the clear and objective review path, which is sort of the goal of this project. So ORS 197307 sub 4 states that a local government may adopt and apply only clear and objective standards to needed housing. So they can include, but are not limited to, some development provisions like density or height, or things like building orientation, or like Doug said, limiting it to a certain length of building before you're breaking up the masses, or a length in total. But you want to make sure that your clear and objective standards aren't discouraging the needed housing through unreasonable delay, or cost or delay. So those are the pieces of the state statute that we want to keep in mind as we're going through and establishing what are the clear and objective design review criteria that we feel are important for any multifamily project if you're going to come in and just have a cut and dry review. Also in your packet, we just noted that objective review standards, as a reminder, you can't, it's a good way to check if you have any personal or subjective judgment by the public official going into it. So like Doug said, you can think of clear and objective as almost numerical. Like it's there or it's not, or it's 10 or more or it's not. You can really easily make this decision without having to put any kind of judgment into it. So with that in mind, we're looking for a way to apply clear and objective review with no judgment calls, just it's straight up is or isn't. Here's our chance to talk about it. What are the most important elements that all multifamily developments should include? So anyone who comes in proposing a multifamily development, what should they be showing? And then does it change just depending on the size? So in the code right now, you have the 14 points like you mentioned, Linda, for the projects that are up to 8 dwelling units, and then 20 points for 9 or more. I think we also linked in our packet the Salem multifamily standards. They do 3 different categories, and they had a smaller that went, I think it was up to 5, and then 6 to 12, and then it was 13 and larger that was their upper threshold. There's a larger population there, so maybe it makes sense to keep it related to what our code currently says, which is the 5 to 8 being the smaller projects. And then finally, that review process question. Is there a scenario, maybe it's related to the size, maybe it's related to the underlying zoning, where a type 1 makes sense? So here's where I'd like to start the discussion. What design elements are most important? And I've given some examples here. So these are what we came up with when trying to conceptualize, like, what are going to be the easiest to apply, but also the most meaningful in the way a site is designed. So open space. Here you can consider having some just minimum percentage of open space on the site. Like we said at the last meeting, you might reduce for distance to a park. That way you can put more housing on the site, but know that people can have access to outdoor space. Maybe there's a credit for active recreation areas. So if you're going to put in a play space or a barbecue area, maybe that counts for a little more of the open space requirement. And then larger developments can be required to provide some private level, like those patios and porches on some of the units. Those do cost more to provide, so then they cost more to live in. So we have heard in the past that, you know, requiring private open space for every single unit can be kind of a barrier to providing housing at approachable income levels. But it's something to keep in mind, especially on a larger project that maybe you can have different price points for your units. For landscaping, consider the current code standard is 15% of the site. And this may include the required parking area landscaping. So here, maybe that 15% makes sense. But my question to you is, how does that interact with any required open space on the site? Can they overlap? Can they 100% overlap? Do they partially overlap? So something to keep in mind there. Let's see, to keep moving you all so that I can see the screen. Vehicle parking, we can consider using the bedroom count, which we do right now, to determine parking if we want to make any changes. There's currently a reduction possible in the code for affordable housing that's near transit, but it requires a discretionary review process to do that. So would you want to include a clear and objective process for reducing parking requirements for affordable housing near transit? Bicycle parking, there's not much here to consider, in my opinion. It requires 1 space for every 4 dwelling units in the current code. So there's not a whole lot there that I would recommend changing. Pedestrian connectivity, you know, there are pedestrian connectivity requirements in the code, but just making that one of your clear and objective standards, specifically connecting to sidewalks, common open spaces, and parking areas. And then each of these 3 criteria have current design review standards in the code that are very clear and objective. So pathways have to be 4 feet wide. They have to be designed to ADA standards. Bicycle parking has to provide a certain number of hook spaces or this or that. These all have really clear design standards associated with them that I think will work well with any kind of clear and objective path that you choose for numbers and types. Building design. We can talk about the percentage of windows on the front of a building or on all street facing elevations, the maximum building length, the building materials, how you break up different floors or different massing areas, if you require different roof lines for different lengths of building, and if you require a defined entry area. And sometimes that can be per certain number of units. So maybe a defined entry area is required 1 for every 5 units. So that accommodates if you have apartment type development. Building orientation, requiring a building to face a street or a common open space. Having graduated setbacks can be applied here, where if you're massing a larger size building or a higher building, that you graduate to a higher setback requirement. This is particularly important when you're adjacent to like lower density development, like especially single story, single family residential. It's nice to maybe increase your setback if you have a taller building or a larger massed building. So those are, I believe, all of the, I'm going to go back to the list so we can just start the discussion. And if I need to go to any of those specific item areas, I'm happy to do that. But let's talk about what's most important when looking at multifamily design.
Well, let's don't all speak at once.
Chris has a hand raised.
I noticed the city of Salem added an extra 7 feet for a certain percentage of pitched roof. Would that be a objective criteria?
Yeah, absolutely. If it had a number of the pitched roof or a number of the setback and a number for the height, it's completely clear and objective.
Okay, Doug, if somebody built a 3-story, got to that 35-foot height restriction, would then it be an extra criteria to allow them an extra 7 feet for a highly pitched roof over, like, say 6 degrees?
Yes.
Okay. And that's not a conflict with our code. It's just, if it's put in there, it's allowed, correct?
Yeah, I think, Chris, I would maybe even back up a little bit further. So when we went through all the middle housing stuff, we had conversations about structure height.
Yeah.
So remember that we measure structure height based upon the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, which means we take the distance halfway between the eave or the gutter and the ridge line, and that distance is halfway. That's where we measure structure height. And then there's other calculations about if you've got a sloping site and so forth, but we're going to talk with the simple, we got a flat site. So it says 35 feet. So effectively that allows a 3-story garden style apartment. So in the middle housing, we talked about, should that be increased or not? And if it was increased, for what zones? So technically we allow apartments in all of our zones. We don't really see in R1, but what we do see is multifamily development, 5 units and above, in our R2 and our R3. And these zones are typically adjacent to either R1, R2, or R3. So I think part of this is, if we're looking to try to accommodate, if we're trying to be efficient with the land supply that we have, should we increase our structure height in R3? And if you wanted to increase the structure height in R3, then you're going to have to deal with the issue about setbacks. And Heather brought this up, is about how do you have that kind of stair step approach so you don't end up with a very tall building, you know, X number of feet away from the property line, and the property or properties adjacent to it are all 1-story single family homes. We constantly hear the residents say, no, 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 no. But if you stair step that so that you have the taller part of the structure or structures in the center of the site, might that be feasible? By adding structure height, you could get an additional floor. That has a direct correlation to number of parking spaces. And then it has a correlation to your open space and landscape requirements. So these things do all tie together. So kind of think of it as if you're at the performing theater and the troubadours are doing their thing and somebody is pulling all the levers so that the curtains go up and down and up and down. Every time you pull on one, it has a consequence on another.
All right, and then with okay, things like landscaping in our code, it says native landscaping. Is that going to remain consistent, or is landscaping going to be an open word?
Yeah, I think what we're looking for in the clear and objective standards would be the percentage of the site in landscaping, or the minimum square footage of landscaping per unit, or the setback area that has to be landscaped. And then that's a great question about what's in the landscaping. What do you think about that, Doug?
I would leave it to the more numeric on the percentage and distance, and let the creativity of the landscape architects figure out what they're going to put in that area. It depends on what you're going to do. If it's active open space, you're going to use one type of material. If it's a passive open space, you're going to use something else. If it's a part of the parking lot landscaping, you're going to use something else. If you try to get so numeric and so prescriptive that says you can only use these plants in these areas, it would be challenging for staff to try to implement. It would be challenging for Heather to try to come up with that, because then you're going to have a conversation, well, what plant species are okay?
On the flip side, you know, if there was some species that really caused trouble, we could exclude easier than include, probably make an exclusive list. I know in my time in Sherwood, which was a long time ago, we started having some problems with street trees being a mono culture. So like every street tree being the exact same type. And then if one pest or if a disease breaks out, you lose all your street trees. So it taught us to require several varieties, you know, so it could be something like that where it's not specific to what's required, but you could require more than one type of something, or you could specifically exclude something that is always breaking sidewalks and does not do well.
So an example of that is you would not want to allow English ivy.
Right. Exactly.
Prohibited plant species.
Does the city actually have a sheet where of plants that are prohibited?
No.
Well, don't we have like invasive species?
Well, we do we have in our stream corridors.
Right. Okay.
We do. So it's pretty much open field for any, you know, commercial multifamily development project. But typically what you see is lawn areas. You see some kinds of shrubs and plants in landscape islands. You find accent shrubbery around the perimeter of parking lots. And part of that is, do you want to screen headlights from abutting properties? Well, if you do, then, you know, you need plants that will grow to a height. It's not setting the minimum, but, well, we can set a minimum. We already do that. But you need plants that will grow to a height of about 30 inches so they screen the headlights from abutting properties or public rights of way. So those are the kinds of prescriptive things that are possible to do. Then you've got those open space areas, and it may be that it's more of a wildflower area of, you know, I don't know, 6,000 square feet. That's more passive, and you might have a path around it, and you might have a park bench or two, and it's a place to go sit and kind of relax and look at the wildflowers as they grow in the spring, and that's okay.
It's a beautiful thing.
But where you might have the playground structure over on the other side of it, complex, and there you might have the, you know, the more coarse bark chips. You've got the play equipment and so forth. Is that part of the landscaping? I've seen codes that say, yes, it is. I've seen codes that say, no, that's a subset of landscaping. And there's a separate prescriptive number that says you have to have X number of square feet of these active recreational areas for, and based upon a number of dwelling units. So it's a place to provide the opportunity for kids to be able to go out and their parents to go out and recreate rather than having to get in a car and drive down to the park.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you talk about landscaping and being prescriptive or not prescriptive, about trees. I don't know about you, but I think when there are trees in parking lots, for example, it just adds something to parking lots, particularly when they're large parking lots. So would that be a possibility, or should that be a possibility? I think it was really interesting, Heather, when you brought up Sherwood, because even though I totally understand what you're saying about diseased trees, not a good thing, but it's such a lovely place to drive through at times because of all the trees.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Sunset Boulevard during the fall, it can't be beat. I still go down there to see that. So I absolutely, to your question about trees in parking lots, parking lot standards already require landscaping areas of certain sizes. And then once you say every so many square feet or so many spaces of parking, you have to provide X number square feet of landscaping. In that X number of landscaping, you must provide one tree for every X number. So you can very numerically do that. Absolutely. And I agree that, landscaping, and like Doug said too, if the priority is to make sure that street car headlights are not shining into neighboring properties, and having some minimum standard that a screen of landscaping is being provided. And you can do that numerically as well. So yep, trees and landscaping, shrubbery, all those things can be numerically required.
Some of that we already have too, so
Right.
we can rely on that.
And just to let everybody know that they also help keep island heat sinks down, and all that other environmental stuff that goes with them.
Yeah, we just had a couple-hour meeting with the Oregon Department of Forestry this afternoon.
Yeah.
And so part of your conversation this evening was talking about these heat indexes in urban areas and providing more trees in parking lots to reduce the heat buildup. But then you also have to balance that.
Yes.
There's always a yin and a yang. Is
Yep.
that we also require that you have to have lighting, right? You got to light your pedestrian ways, you got to light your parking lot. So then you start to run into, potentially conflicts of, well, you need to have a landscape island every 7 spaces, the way the code is currently written. It has to have a tree, but you also have to have your parking lot lighting. And our lighting standards are addressed to the number of foot candles at the property line, be it a public right of way or interior. So that leaves them some flexibility about where they put their parking lot lighting. But you can run into conflicts between your requirements to require trees and your requirements to be able to illuminate the parking lot at the same time. And you've only got so much space, and where do you put this stuff and still make it safe? And so we have to stay away. I would highly encourage stay away from a subjective, because we can't do that, about what lighting standards are, and they need to be very numeric in nature. And we can keep the 0.5 foot candles at the property perimeter, but you want to make sure you're creating safe environments for in the parking lot. It's nighttime, it's Oregon. Remember, it does get dark at 4 o'clock in the winter. And for the pedestrians and those who need ADA access also need the lighting for their safety and security.
Awesome. And then at this time, I'm going to ask another one on the tree. We don't have a tree list of ones that only grow a certain height, because I know also adding trees to it, there's also maintenance issues there, that yin and yang thing that you were talking about. And I know the city of Tigard at one time did have a arborist make up a list of trees that did grow over a certain height, width, etc. Is that being considered at all?
That would be a broader probably discussion than this particular project, but I will say resource wise, I actually did a stint as an intern at Friends of Trees a million years ago, and one of my jobs was to create a tree resource like you're describing, where it described exactly how tall a tree would get at maturity, what the spread was, what the growth rate was per year. So that is, I believe, still available online as well. It might be similar to the Tualatin one, or maybe shared resources there. But yeah, those resources are available to include in, you can link those to code criteria and things. But, that would be probably a broader discussion as far as city policy of wanting to do that, especially once you're talking about trees in the right of way. If you're starting to talk about street trees and things, and but yeah, I think that's a valid point of because once you do that, then you can say, well, if you're planting a tree that will grow at maturity to over 20 feet, then you can say, well, your street lights then can be 12 feet and there won't be, a large impact, or you can start numerically dividing those out. But again, that might be a broader discussion than what goes into the clear and objective multifamily review. Might be more like a parking area landscaping discussion.
And I think Heather's on point. We do have requirements for street trees, and we have a list. And so we've got the shorter, the medium, the taller, and the narrow spread, the medium spread, and the wide spread. Then we've got standards about how close a street tree can be to a street light. And then we got to deal with the conflicts about traffic control signs. And then we have to deal with mailboxes. We have standards about root barriers so they don't break up sidewalks and so forth. So we have all of this stuff on street trees. And just so the committee knows, we actually started on a process before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, where we were looking at revising our street tree list and so forth to make sure we had the right species that are available from nurseries and so forth. And hopefully we'll pick that project back up in the future.
Do trees always have to be planted? Can they be more like shrubs and things like that?
In the right of way, you are required to have street trees.
Trees.
And so the standard is basically 30 to 40 feet on center on local streets of minor collectors, and 40 feet on center on major collectors and arterials.
Thank you, Doug, very much.
So nice to have you here as a resource, Doug. So we don't have to hold on. Let me look that up in the code. Just know it. Okay. How about building design? Are there specific things about a project like breaking up the massing of the building, either vertically or horizontally? Defining those stories. In fact, I grabbed some images. I'm gonna, if anybody gets sick from quick screening, just close your eyes really fast. Okay, here's some projects that I pulled. I think I pulled this one right off the Newberg multifamily project website. So this one doesn't specifically separate out the different levels of the house, but of the structure, but it has a lot of articulation around windows and then the corner entryway there. And then if you'll look here, this one in the middle has a really clear white line separating the first floor from the upper 2 stories. And then again, here in the corner, you've got these kind of, I guess it's the decks of these units that are providing this sort of visual break between the levels. So that's considered, some sort of building articulation that separates the levels of the structure horizontally. And then vertically, you can get the same type of effect. So this one has white line, the middle one has white lines. It's got porches and decks that are separating breaking up the mass of the building. Certainly windows can do that, so you don't have long expanses of buildings that are just plain. Same here, they've used the windows, they've used some decks, and here they've actually used some bump outs and some color. So there are different, articulations to the building that can be added, and you can require basically just that every certain number of feet you provide one of these. It doesn't have to be specific to the paint color or the materials or the windows, but you can very easily require those articulations to break up mass of the building. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. The out of those three pictures, the one on top where you've got a entryway, and then the two.
Sorry, it's scrolling slowly, but there we go. Okay, the one on top.
Now the one on top, you've got the entryway from the parking lot, but then you've also got the balconies separated. And the one in the middle, it's got the kitchens. And it's not so obvious where the entryways are.
Okay.
Doug, how much difference in cost are between those two designs? Which is better for a builder cost-wise?
It all depends, Chris. It all depends.
That is such a great question though, Chris. And honestly, Mary is going to be doing some outreach to builders and to housing advocates and ask those types of questions. I think that's a great question.
Well, I know my grandfather would have taken the same blueprint and did it over and over and over again if it wasn't for my grandmother. Yeah, I know that's a cost saving issue for builders, especially when you're going into design elements. But yeah, it would be interesting to know actually from their perspective, what is easy for them to break up and it not cost them a whole lot and still provide the elements.
So it is a really good question. It's harkening me back to when I rewrote the code on design standards for multifamily in another community. And this is not speaking bad about developers. Developers' most economical way to build is build a rectangle with punch windows, a continuous roof line, because you don't want to have a flat roof in Oregon. So it looks like a barrack. And you then have a short entryway for your 3-story, and it's, you go to your stairs, and that's it. There's no balconies, there's no bay windows, there's no nothing. That is the most economical for them. And so that's where this committee gets to look at and say, well, do you want that? If you say we do not want that, it's like, okay, then do you want some roof line articulation? And as Heather was pointing out, you can break it up with different building materials, horizontally and vertically. Do you require that there's X number of square feet of balcony space and storage for each unit, be it ground floor, second floor, third floor? Do you want X number of square feet of windows on a wall plane? So just take away the articulation of the wall, but on that plane, whatever, however long it may be, let's say it's 100 feet. Do you want a percentage that says X number of percent of that wall has to be windows? Then you get to these issues about the ground floor, which usually has a concrete patio. The upper floors have a wooden deck. I know I'm kind of toggling over into the landscape stuff, but can you include private space as part of public space? Do you specifically define private space? So like in the center drawing where you had the ground floor, do you say X number of square feet for a patio and then X number of square feet outside of that patio, and you require that it has to have shrubbery, so it defines that it's a private space rather than a public space? I've done that before. The bottom one is more, it's a downtown urban setting rather than a suburban garden. But that's more of a portion of a building that's a podium building for parking that's underneath it. So again, you know, thinking about when you have these multifamily, you also need to kind of consider about the environment or location where they're building it. Sometimes it can be in a commercial area. Sometimes it's in a residential area. The top one is an interesting project of trying to address issues about proximity to existing single family homes that are one story and or manufactured homes, and trying to address how do you bring that scale, the massing of that building down so it makes it compatible, again, under current standards, with the abutting development that's already there. Does it cost more? Yes, it does. So that directly translates to rents.
Okay. So we don't want barracks, but we want our citizens to have, or people that come to our city, living in quality, accessible homes too.
And keep in mind is that in our housing needs analysis, where we were at about 72 to 73% of our housing stock was detached single family home, the housing needs analysis says in the future, we're only going to have about 60% of our housing stock be detached single family. And we're going to have 64% be multifamily, which is a toggling towards more multifamily. And we're going to have more townhomes. We've already dealt with the townhomes. So Heather helped us when we dealt with all the townhome stuff.
Yep.
As part of the middle housing. And so, you know, keep in mind about, you build one of these structures that are there for 50 years. And Chris, and so you're kind of getting, you know, what kind of environment do you want residents in Newberg to be able to live in, knowing that it has a cost ramification associated with it. But by and large, we're going to have more multifamily. It's going to be more of the suburban 3-story, unless you recommend we want to go higher or create a new multifamily zone or something like that. And so those projects I listed earlier are some of the recent examples in the last 10 years based on our current standards. And so there's good elements out of those projects.
Well, I noticed with the higher density that there is more of a footprint on the property, like the lower one, the podium type one. And I would love to see, because obviously there are some people who are going to need outdoor space, stuff like that, to raise a little height if they can put in some areas for open space, because it also will help with stress and mental health. And that's a significant thing for everybody in the future.
Yeah, I think
So
too.
Absolutely.
So keep in mind on this one is if you were doing a project like on the bottom and it's in a commercial zone, and if you were in Newberg, there is no landscape requirements.
yes, I
You
noticed.
can cover 100%. And here you have an example of a project that is a block away from a community park.
But you
And
know,
my
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris. I'm
Linda.
sorry.
My concern about kids going down and using the public parks right now and stuff is, it's kind of scary. And I personally would not, even when I lived in the city, I wouldn't let my kids go down to the park unless I was there with them anyway. And at times it was not good to be in the park even for adults. So it's nice in a closer proximity for parents and new families with work schedules, studying, other things like that. It's for me, I benefited on properties that had open space in close proximity, but that was just for me and my needs.
And I wonder, you know, I think building costs are really expensive, and I think they're escalating from what I've seen.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm wondering, if in light of that, if it's even more important just for people's mental health and for livability to really think very seriously about landscaping and what we can do to really, if possible, increase the amount of landscaping requirements, I don't know, or to really think about going back to my tree issue, especially, you know, since you've been talking to the Forestry Commission or something. And in light of global warming, which is a real issue, I wonder if we should reconsider those landscaping codes and whether or not they should be rethought.
So initial thought comes to mind that if you want to address and have more open space landscaping, then you're going to need to increase the structure height. Otherwise, a project is not going to pencil out on a square foot basis.
Yeah, and just one thing I've heard too in doing developer interviews is, you know, 3 stories is kind of the sweet spot before you're required to put in an elevator, before different structural standards come into play. So, you know, we do see a lot of 3-story development. So if you offer higher, I'm not sure you necessarily get it, but my mind is bouncing on this. I know it's not popular, but there could be a parking trade-off if you were near services and near transit, and maybe you're right in downtown with the bottom one, maybe you required 2 fewer parking spaces and you have a 20 by 20 open space to provide something in, you know, a thought.
Or just 1 or 2 extra trees.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. The elevator issue. I actually did a project for a place over in Southeast Portland. They were going to be required elevator for disability, and I had to go through that with them. But yes, you're right. The minimum elevator cost that I found at that time was almost $200,000 plus a maintenance, and I'm pretty sure that would be distributed in rent as well, passed on. So that might, plus there's maintenance, long-term issues with it. And thank you for bringing that up. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Thank you.
And Heather's right. And I think, you know, as we go through conversations with developers, is that a 2-story unit the pro forma doesn't pencil out given the cost of the land and the cost of materials and labor. You get to that 3, and even today, it's a challenge to try to do that. You go to 4, now you got elevators. Now you've got a project it's cost more per square foot or more per door for rent.
Sorry, I have a bias in elevators anyway.
Yes, I know. I'm aware.
I'll
right.
also add one thing. I think I mentioned this last time too, but do we want to consider allowing affordable housing developments to go higher depending on the zone or where they are? Because I do know the more units you can build in affordable housing, the more likely you are to get funding, because they want the biggest bang for their buck, especially if you're going to get from federal or state money, which is basically they always have to, because there's just not enough funds anyway. So I'm just going to put that out there as a possibility to look into.
Thank you very much.
Well, Jason, Sharon, we haven't heard much from you.
Oops, wait. Hey, yeah, I'm listening. I agree with everything being said, and those are all valid points. I would just like, I hadn't thought about, I've always been a strong proponent of the fact that I think, like in this main part of Newberg, we've got public parks that are within 10 minutes. A child could ride his bicycle down to the park. I like that. I don't think of them as dangerous, but maybe in the city, in Portland, there is an element that is that way. I don't think of that out here.
Well, you may
So,
not think of that, Sharon, but I've actually turned people in from shooting up in the bathroom in downtown or downtown park and some other things. And I have gotten concerned about kids being there without their parents with that going on. But
right.
that's something that unfortunately every place, big or small, is just going to have to deal with.
I know that I do like the idea of the fact that you have maybe incorporated in an open area that the maybe multifamily structure is built around, that there could be a playground. What I like about that is that the people can actually watch their children play.
Yeah.
I like the idea of bringing playgrounds on site too for children. So those are all really good thoughts.
Well, typically from the development community, what I'm hearing recently is, they're looking for projects that are 100 units to 200 units. There's an economy of scale. So all of a sudden now you're starting to look at sites that are pretty much in the 5+ acres in size.
So that's huge.
Though, and they're bigger, but that's where you get these opportunities to have these on-site shared outdoor areas, open space, play
Right.
structure, playground, so forth. But then you got to think about the other side of the ledger, where we have multifamily zoning, and it might be an apartment project of 10 to 15 units. And is there enough land or not, given that particular proximity, to require some type of outdoor space amenity? And that could be in a residential area. And then you got this issue about, well, what do you do about downtown? Downtown's supposed to be different anyway.
Right.
It's supposed to be more dense. It's your central business district. We want housing there to support the businesses and so forth. And so again, there's these trade-offs. There's no right or wrong.
Doug, here's a wacky idea. So you mentioned the economy of scale. So yeah, that applies to a developer when he's trying to, go about a particular property. So what if he was able to achieve the economy with scale across multiple properties through reduction of application fees? In other words, say it takes 5 acres to do 100 units. Say if there's 5 1-acre parcels around, and they can kind of lump it all together into one development and save money on the fees that way.
I have not run into many developers who are doing multiple projects that way.
If I can just respond to that too, the thing that immediately popped in my mind was how different every site is. Whether I'm writing a narrative for an applicant or reviewing on behalf of the city, there's never been a case where I haven't had to specifically look at the different street frontages, different roadway classifications. Some have protected resources on them, some do not. So once you start spreading the sites, I just can't, right off the top of my head, think of a way that the staff would be able to review that in an economical way, because there's so many moving pieces on every different project, I guess.
I think that if, like Doug said, so if you're doing a multi-unit building, like right behind our main street in Newberg, you would expect that to look more urban and to have a different vibe. If you're out more in the residential areas, you would expect it to have more of a family vibe. And so I guess those are the things that if I was thinking about clear and objective things to look at, it would also be, what is the setting? Is it a more urban setting? Then you would have a more urban dwelling. People would be going home and going out into the city more, like downtown Portland. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. And Doug queued up my question perfectly here about project size and where do we break it and, you know, separate large from small. And if I could add to this PowerPoint just on the fly, I would add, and does project location or underlying zoning, you know, it sounds like we'd like to see some different things on properties that are in the R zones versus properties that are in the that are what was the, or can't remember your mixed use zoning.
SP or
Oh, okay.
C3.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, C3, yes, and NSP. So maybe we have a different clear and objective standard, whether you're
Right.
in the R zone or the S or C.
Right.
So another brainstorming idea. Uh, So how desperate are we for cheaper housing? In other words, what if we were to allow an area designated specifically for a barracks, for lack of a better word, I do like the word though, type development. And you could, you know, mask some of it with some, maybe some cheap landscaping or some, you know, I don't know, some sort of exterior trim features or something like that. But the actual construction of the building is just simple. I mean, are we willing to discount every measure, you know, based on that? Because I mean, if we're building, if we're not actually building, we're talking about the rules, but if we're looking for a particular thing, we're looking for people to be able to afford to work here. And right now that's basically not possible. And so it's like, okay, if we really need people to work here and do things here, how far are we willing to go to facilitate that? Yeah.
Thanks, Jason. That's a great brainstorming thought. I'll leave it up to you, community members and staff, to discuss that. But that is a really unique perspective. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and just throwing stuff out there.
Yeah, I love it.
It's actually a good idea, Commissioner Dell.
So is Jason talking about putting barrack style housing out at the airport?
Yeah, that's what I
We've
thought.
already got a ton of those shotgun houses right
I
next to
vote
us.
for that.
And NIMBY's definitely something for sure. Because where do you put it?
Well, I think it's a great topic for discussion. It's worth further examination for sure. So just to sort of direct you to the question of what's a large project versus what's a small project, your code does give current guidance on this topic and says the break is somewhere around 8 units. Does that make sense? Do you feel like 8 units is the right break? Should there be a medium that goes up to the 15 or something, where maybe you have a few more criteria but not the full?
Anything over 8 is large.
That's, well, not large, but it requires a higher number of points on your current multifamily design review.
Seems a little restrictive.
What are your thoughts on that, Doug?
Well, I'm trying to think about when was the last time somebody in Newberg built an 8-unit apartment project.
What's your typical number, do you think, Doug?
Downtown, we're seeing, you know, around the 25 to 30 unit number.
Okay.
For the ones out.
I looked at running the numbers about doing almost that very thing between 8 and 12 units back in 2015, and there was no way I could make the numbers work out.
Yeah. So our other projects are been running what, about 48 On the one down on South River,
Thank you.
Gaskins was right around 100 units. Chehalem Point was over 100 units. Meadowbrook phases 1 and 2 are going to be a little over 100 units. Probably closer to 130. Crestview Crossing is 54. We did just approve a new project, Planning Commission did, for a 24 unit apartment project.
So is there, forgive me for not knowing off the top of my head, based on your buildable lands inventory, but is there even much infill property where we would see something under 15 or 20 units?
From an infill perspective, it depends on if your pro forma allows you to buy a property with an existing house or houses and tear them down. You know,
Gotcha.
just finding vacant land, no.
Okay, so maybe it's less important that we have a small review process versus a large review process. Maybe we don't need to focus too much on that.
Yeah, you know,
I would
look at-
say in other cities, I have not seen that I've worked in. It's all been the same criteria for any type of
Anything
multifamily.
over 5 or over.
Yeah.
But it does sound like it would be important to distinguish the underlying zoning because it's different, that there's a different purpose of multifamily that's in the downtown core. Maybe you're not getting as many families with small children versus the areas that you would want to see more of a play space or an open area where people can run around a bit. I think
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's maybe where the distinction comes in. Okay, that's great. And it sounds like as far as, so if I can just, I know we're a little close to when we said we'd do public comments, but if I can just go over the review process briefly. So there's currently the type 2 review required. Are there scenarios where a type 1 is appropriate? And Mary mentioned to me in an email today that could it be that in the highest density zoning district, a type 1 is appropriate because it's less impactful on neighboring properties. You wouldn't necessarily need to provide the notice in the same way you would if you were adjacent to a lower density type zone. Or is it the fact that all multifamily is providing some sort of impact, and so having a public notice is appropriate? And then on the flip side, if I can play my own opposite, I hate the term devil's advocate, so I'm going to stay away from it. But there are some, Mary pointed out that if you receive notice of a clear and objective application, it sort of gives you a false sense of ability to make a change, right? So if someone's coming in and they're meeting all the code criteria and it's going to be approved and there's no question about that, sending notice does let people know it's happening, but it might give them a false sense that they can make some changes to it or in some way impede that development from happening. So, you know, maybe it's some sort of thing where you give notice that it's happening, but you don't give notice that you can provide feedback, you know, like if you feel like it's important to notify the neighbors, but that runs a bit afoul of our whole land use system where people are entitled to give their opinion about things. So we've kind of gone back and forth, and if I can tell the secret, I think Mary and Doug fall on different sides of this one sometimes as well. Any thoughts on that from the group, from the committee?
Well, in our 15.100.020 type 1 procedure, it does, in number B, it does include the single family dwellings, duplex, triplex, quadruplex, town houses, and all those can be done in type 1. But since this is, as you said, 5 or more dwellings, I think it would be we would have a lot of problems with not denoting it publicly. Other commissioners, do you think there's any zoning issues that where it would be appropriate and okay for just Doug to go ahead and do it, or director?
That would also happen in a type 2. So Doug is the final decider in a type 2 as well. It's just, the biggest difference really is public notice between a type 1 and type 2.
So you could have, and I'd have to look at maps, but you could have a situation where you might, going to try to stream of consciousness. So please, nobody hold me to this. But you could have a situation where you had a site that was already surrounded by R3, higher density. And don't want to really use the word infill, but here's a vacant lot, it's already surrounded. Could a type 1 work there because you've already got the higher density around it? But then you could have a situation where you've got an R2 where you might have a mix where you've got detached single family, you've got some apartment units, and with type 1, nobody would get notified. Type 2, they would. If you were downtown, we've got some areas that are zoned for R3, higher density residential. They've got existing 1-story, maybe a 2-story structure on it, but they butt up against commercial. And so commercial in the downtown, we don't have a height limitation. It's regulated by the airport and the conical surfaces.
You're welcome.
So yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Jason. So if you bought up a couple lots and you did a type 1 in an R3 next to a C3 in the downtown, do budding property owners, should they be notified or not? I think the other piece, there was a question that was asked in the Q&A about structure height. So in our residential zones, we do have structure height limitations. In our other zones, we do not, except for the institutional zone, which does allow multifamily housing. You can go up to 75 feet in height. So we've got this wonky mix of, it's like a potpourri bowl. But all of the others outside of our residential, R1, R2, and R3, and then with the nuance of the institutional, it's all regulated by the airport conical surfaces about what your structure height can be. So your distance away from the runway.
I'll also add a couple of other things that are sort of related. So in other communities that I've worked in, if it's a higher density zone abutting a lower density zone, then there's a transition step back that you have to provide. So it would be, like the building could only be 3 stories high within the required setback, and then you could go higher, but it'd have to be farther away from the property line. So it's kind of giving a less of a height impact next to lower density zones, right? So that kind of takes away from or helps with potential impact of a larger building next to a lower density zone. So that's something to consider. And then also a type 2 process does take longer and it is more expensive. So developers, affordable housing developers, things like that, they see a type 2 process and they go, sometimes it's not worth it to go that process because they just don't have the time or the money to do it. So there's pros and cons, like we've been talking about this entire time, but that's just a few more things to think about.
Okay, thank you.
Well, we certainly don't have to solve that issue tonight. We could carry it forward. And I think as we talked about previously, we'll definitely be hearing from the development community, housing advocates, other folks as well. So that can also aid the discussion, like Mary's saying, what really would keep a project from being able to develop cost-wise and timing-wise there. So just to make sure that we stay on track with our time, So what I heard this evening about the most important clear and objective review criteria, some sort of landscaping and open space, definitely larger projects, providing some sort of usable open space on site. Numeric landscaping requirements are important, trees and shrubs and parking areas, making sure that stairs, step back heights, so that if we have multifamily development next to single family residential, we're being aware of that and using, like Mary said, those buffers and those setbacks. Our location matters, whether we're in a zone that's zoned residentially or if it's commercial or mixed use or institutional, as Doug said. Articulation on the building is important, but we'd like to hear more from the development community about what could be done without really raising prices extraordinarily. I think that is most of what I've gotten. So if others have ones that I missed or that you'd like to add, now would be a good time to do that.
I have one, Commissioner Wright. This may not have to do with any standards, but Doug, in the Eugene planning and development for middle housing in their duplex areas, they have something I didn't consider. For CC&R properties, conditions, covenants, and restrictions are a private land agreement that stipulate the use or control of a property. In certain cases, CC&Rs may prohibit middle housing on property. How is the city dealing with this currently?
By state law, CCNRs
Prohibited past
cannot do that.
anymore.
Nope.
But the ones prior to 2019 are grandfathered in?
I would not say that. I would say that would be a legal issue between the homeowners association and their residents that they would have to resolve. I've asked that question before as well. That's basically the legal answer I got from the state.
Okay.
I do remember that, Doug. I remember you asking that with middle housing. Yep.
See.
I have a question for Doug. How hard do we have to twist a developer's arm to show up to one of these meetings? Might be interesting.
We have in this process to have some discussions with the development community. I think that's an opportunity to invite them to a future meeting so that they can share their views and opinions and so forth with the committee overall. I think just trying to just invite them up front, so just come to this meeting. They're gonna go, oh, well,
Hard to offer cookies over Zoom.
yeah, cookies over Zoom, great. Oreos with a glass of milk. Right?
All the usual tricks don't work over Zoom.
That's right.
When I used to eat cookies, snickerdoodles were mine.
There you go.
I think it would be a challenge just, to get them to just show up at a meeting like this. When we went through the middle housing, we couldn't get the development community to really show up. It was the citizens, but we did talk with the development community and got their feedback.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
and we'll share whatever they provide. We'll share those notes with you all too.
Sure. It's be nice to have them have, somebody with experience on the ground from the other side and on our discussions, because, that kind of insight is pretty valuable.
Well, and there were a few Q&A this evening, so maybe that is a good segue, that maybe we do have someone representative of the development community. Is it okay, Mary, if we advance to public comment? Okay.
Yeah, if whoever is attending, if they want to add additional comments to their Q&A ones, feel free to raise your hand and then I'll know to promote you over. Okay. I think we are good, but the Q&A comments were good and we'll also record those as well. So
Okay.
we'll have them.
And just to mention them, it was Keith Leonard, and he mentioned just some thoughts on making the facade interesting but construction feasible, that you could take an overhead view of the development, so that there's variation in the footprint, and that helps. And then regarding landscaping, that it's important to talk about continued maintenance as well, because he does see some times where that's not happening. And then Doug specifically addressed his question about building height outside of airport restrictions within the downtown. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing because our next topic is just project next steps, and we'll just talk about our next meeting and what comes next with the project. There you all are. We have on our scope and on our project schedule to meet again in November. I don't know, Mary, if tonight is a night we set that meeting, or if you do that internally as staff and then announce it, or what is your process?
Yeah, we'll do it internally, but usually it's going to be later in the months because they have their planning commission meeting earlier in the month.
Just be careful with later in November.
Oh, yeah, good point. Maybe it's more
Oh,
mid,
yeah.
or it may be combined with the planning commission meeting if we need to. So
Okay.
I'll send an email out to the advisory committee / planning commission and see what works best for everyone.
Okay, great. And regarding that meeting, I think what is happening between now and then are some of those developer conversations, Mary, that you're having, and we will be taking the thoughts from this evening, as well as that matrix that we put together, and putting together some draft code recommendations for the clear and objective path and for other multifamily considerations. And I believe we share a draft of that in November and get feedback from this group. And then in January, we meet for a final time to get the final product before we go to a joint work session with you all and the city council. So really the next meeting will have some code before you, which I know all planning commissions like to look at. Okay. Is there anything else that you have, Mary, or anything else for the good of the order from anyone?
I don't think so.
Yes.
Oh, Chris, go for it.
Commissioner Dale had a really good thought about reaching out, and if we can't get them to come to us, if we find an event where a bunch of builders happen to be, and they will sit down and answer, are the commissioners willing to go meet at an event, other a room full of builders, or supply them with a questionnaire that they can randomly answer on paper as they're walking through a convention center?
I think that's a great idea.
Any of those things be an option?
So first of all, you are a public body. So any such meeting that would include developers would have to be a noticed public meeting, so the public can participate.
Can it be a workshop? Like you're just finding out information?
You still have to
It
notice
just
that it's,
Period. Okay.
yeah, since you are an advisory committee for this particular project, but by Oregon law, you are a public body, which means we have to notice all of the meetings. And given the way the law reads now, we also have to be able to do it both in person and electronically.
Now is electronically. Is it okay for us commissioners to randomly walk up to a builder and ask him, you know, what are your cost values, or questions like that?
You
I
can.
believe as long as there's not something on the docket, you're okay with that. And if there is something, you have to just expose it as ex parte contact.
So remember is that you are functioning as a citizens advisory committee for this code audit project. So yes, if you talk to a developer and you got some information, you could bring it back and share it with the committee, and then everybody would have the same information. You just have to remember down the road is that we're going to get to a point that there's going to be a proposal to make changes to the comprehensive plan and the development code. And so all of you are going to have to go through the step of divulging that you were the Citizens Advisory Committee for this project And if we document everything, it'll all be in the record and it's there, but we'll cross that bridge. when
I
we
officially
get in.
resigned.
Oh, no, you don't.
Just kidding.
No, you don't. We're gonna build you a barracks of ADUs.
There you go.
That you're gonna be in how old are you now? Another 50 years old. So if we were to be in the barracks housing in another 50 years, I'll be dead personally. By that age, I hope. Yeah, would you still want to live in the barracks? Could you live in the barracks? It's a thought.
I think that's a 20-year-old's game. And I did that.
Yeah, yeah, I've been in barracks as well.
But even
So-
20-year-olds need someplace.
So all good questions. I mean, if you happen to be in Fred Meyer and you see a developer you knew and you ask them some questions and you jotted them down and you brought them back to the next CAC meeting and shared it with everybody, that would be okay as your role as a CAC member.
Okay.
Well, and as Mary said, as she's reaching out to developers and to housing advocates, she'll certainly invite them, let them know when we're meeting and, encourage them to come, but, we'll see if
Help
that-
us help you.
Yeah.
We want to help you.
Very much so.
Sounds like a Jerry Maguire moment. Help me, help you, help me.
Yeah.
Exactly. They might even remember that.
I know. I was gonna say I didn't even remember that till you just said that. Jerry Maguire. They had that last week here at the drive-in theater.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was the opening movie. But anyway, all right. Thank you everybody for your great input and being here this evening. Really appreciate all your work and effort.
Thank you, everybody, for your time and your great feedback. I really appreciate it, and I have good information to move forward with. So looking forward to seeing you all, hopefully not too late in November.
Okay, great.
Bye,
Okay, good
Sharon.
night, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.